Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel, thanks for joining me. Today I wanted to talk to you a little bit about my new camera. So as you might have seen in the last couple of videos, I got a new camera recently. This is it here, my Fujifilm GFX 50R, and it is a digital medium format camera with a 51 megapixel sensor. And this is my previous main camera, my Olympus OM-D E-M1 MkII. Now I guess there's probably a few questions as to why I wanted to change camera and what the benefits are, so that's why I thought I'd make a quick video. The first reason is image quality. I've always been a big fan of the Olympus cameras. I honestly do truly feel that their image quality is really great. The Olympus Micro Four Thirds system is a fantastic camera system, and I've had my E-M1 MkII for almost 2 years, and I've been using the system in general for 6 years, a little bit longer. Excellent cameras with a lot of good advantages, but they do have a much smaller sensor. How much smaller? Well, it is roughly a quarter of the size of a 35mm full frame sensor, which is something like the Sony A7 series cameras and your Canon 5Ds. And then the GFX has a bigger sensor again, bigger than the full frame sensor. So it's a medium format camera. It has a 44 by 33mm sensor. A full frame sensor is 36 by 24 millimeters, and the Micro Four Thirds are 17 by 12.5 or 13, so a fair difference in size in sensors. What effect this sensor size difference has on image quality depends on a few different things. One thing that you do find with something like the Micro Four Thirds cameras is their pixels are smaller and more dense. So it's 20 megapixels in this particular camera. So that's a pixel density comparing to about 80 megapixels in a 35mm sensor. The disadvantage to having the higher pixel density is you do get more noise at higher ISO. It's not really an issue when you're shooting at base ISO, but even if you shoot at low ISOs and you have to bring up your shadows or your exposure, you can introduce noise, and that is, people say it's just because of the smaller sensor. It's realistically because of the smaller, higher density pixels. Now obviously we look at something like this, more resolution, but it's 50 megapixels in a bigger sensor, so it doesn't have that same sort of pixel density. If we're comparing the density of the pixels in the EM1 to 80 megapixels in a full frame sensor, then this is 35 to 40 megapixels, so a lot less pixel density. Where this helps is low light performance and high ISO performance. So you don't get as much grain at the same sort of ISOs. If I was to take a photo at ISO 3200 on both these cameras, this camera would be much cleaner. Now you're probably thinking I'm a landscape photographer, so that doesn't really bother me, and no, you're right, it doesn't. Which is why I've stuck with the Olympus cameras for so long, because I shoot them all at base ISO, so I'm never too concerned. I do sometimes have to lift the shadows, and it can introduce a little bit of noise, but the reality is, for most people, it's unnoticeable and it doesn't negatively affect things. But if I can reduce it, then it's not a bad thing to do so. I've also just always had a big soft spot for GFX cameras ever since they first released the GFX 50S, which is very similar to this camera in all of its technical stuff. It's just a different body. So the GFX 50S was the first of the Fujifilm mirrorless medium format cameras. Same sensor, same processing engine, it's just a different body. It's a bigger body, it's a more SLR style body, whereas this one is obviously the rangefinder, smaller viewfinder on the corner. It doesn't have a grip. This is not part of the camera, this is added on. So very basic brick-like design. I did get a chance to play with the GFX 50S a few years ago and absolutely loved it. And then after they announced the 50R, about a year or two after the S, I just fell in love with the rangefinder body, because I think they're awesome. It's smaller, it's lighter, and yeah, it's just a great camera. And as a landscape photographer, that image quality improvement is worthwhile to me, to be honest. This lens is a really great lens, f3.5 maximum aperture, so it's not a fast lens, but it's not super slow either. Minimum aperture is f32. It's not the lens I use the most though, because I just don't love wide angle as much. It gives about the same sort of field of view as a 40mm would on a 35mm full frame camera. So it's not super wide. It's actually a really nice carry around lens if you're going out to the shop, you have a coffee and take your camera and that sort of thing. Really nice walk around lens, and it is a really nice sort of mild wide angle. I have used it in the field for landscape photos quite a bit, but it's just not my favorite focal length. So what do I do for longer lenses? You may have seen in my last video, I adapt lenses. So this being a mirrorless camera means it has a shorter distance from the back of the lens, like from the lens mount flange to the image sensor, than what SLR cameras do. This means that it's really easy to adapt lenses from other camera systems. So what I mostly do is use the lenses from my Hasselblad film camera. Being a medium format film camera, they cover this image sensor no problem at all, and they're very good quality lenses. So that means I've got probably 5 lenses I can adapt on, and then I have good lenses to use on this camera. How that works is quite a simple process. You just need an adapter. This is a very basic one here. So it's very simple, just like changing a lens. Take off the standard lens, pop the adapter on like that, that just clicks on like a normal lens, and then put the Hasselblad lens on just as you would on a Hasselblad. And now I have an 80mm 2.8 Hasselblad lens on there. So that gives me that little bit more reach. I don't use this lens all that often, to be honest. I brought it down for this video because it's a lot smaller than my other lenses. The one I use the most is 150mm. That gives that sort of short to medium telephoto, which is my favorite. And I also have the 250mm, which gives a really nice longer telephoto, which works really well on this camera as well. But that's quite simple. These are the lenses I use the most. It's also really very possible to adapt lenses from 35mm cameras as well. You do get varying degrees of success in how well they cover the larger GFX image sensor. One that I like to use a little bit is this Minolta lens. It's a Minolta Rokkor 58mm f1.4, so it's a large aperture sort of standard lens. It's a bit old, but it looks really cool on the camera, and it actually does a really good job of covering the sensor. Little to no vignetting at all. And once you stop it down to about f2.8, it gets really quite sharp. F1.4 is nice to get a nice dreamy look and really show a depth of field. But it's a nice lens I like to use. Another lens that I like to use quite a lot is a different Olympus lens. It's this 100mm Olympus lens. It's an f2.8, and this lens is really sharp. I use it quite a lot on my Olympus film camera, and it actually covers the sensor really well with the GFX, and it's just a nice sharp lens with nice rendering. So that's pretty much the lenses I like to adapt. Am I going to get rid of my E-M1 MkII? No, absolutely not. I love this camera. Okay, it doesn't have the larger sensor, it's got a smaller sensor, and it doesn't perform as well in low light and all of that, but this is a fantastic camera. It has incredibly good autofocus, much better autofocus than the GFX. It's got hybrid contrast and phase detect autofocus, whereas the GFX is contrast detect only. So the GFX doesn't track moving subjects as well. And even with stationary subjects, I find that the Olympus is faster. Autofocus is excellent. It is a fast camera in general. It can shoot up to 18 frames a second with autofocus and exposure tracking. I don't tend to shoot it at its maximum speed like that very often. If I'm doing burst shooting, I tend to limit it to 10 frames a second. Still more than enough. The GFX does something like 3.5 frames a second maximum. So there are definitely things this camera does that the GFX doesn't. Another thing, actually, very important thing, is IBIS, in-body image stabilisation. This one has really great sensor shift stabilisation, which is really good for handheld shooting. The GFX has no stabilisation at all, and none of my lenses do either. So for general walk around handheld photography, big advantage. And also I use this camera in my day job. It's a really, really great camera. It's got 2 card slots, it's got really great weather sealing, and it's really intuitive to use. So I'm definitely not getting rid of it. I may not use it as much in my videos anymore, but I still love this camera and I still love my Olympus system, so I will not be getting rid of this camera. This isn't a full review or anything, just introducing my new camera and the reasons I got it. So I think that I might throw up a couple of images from this camera. I might even take a couple of pictures around the place with these adapted lenses to show you. But yeah, I just wanted to basically introduce the new camera. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you got something out of this video and enjoyed it. If you do have any questions at all about the GFX or about my Olympus system or anything, please hit me up. I'm happy to answer any questions that I can. Leave any good or bad feedback you may have down below. And yeah, if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my channel. I really appreciate you watching my content. I hope you had a good time, and I'll talk to you again soon.